They called it the King of the Battlefield, a squat, unassuming gun with a thick barrel, a crew of sweaty Australian soldiers, and a thunderous voice that could be heard for miles. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly beautiful. But when the Japanese soldiers in the jungles of New Guinea or on the beaches of Borneo heard its deep rolling roar echo through the trees, they knew what was coming, and they feared it. This was the QF 25-pounder, the gun the Australians loved and the Japanese came to despise, not just because it was powerful, but because it broke something deeper. It shattered morale, ripped apart hidden jungle bunkers, and turned their long-held advantage of discipline and stealth into sheer panic. But before we understand why this single weapon became such a dark symbol of hatred, we have to go back to the forgotten corners of the Pacific War. In the early 1942s, Australia stood on edge. The fall of Singapore had shaken the entire empire. The Japanese had swept through the Pacific like wildfire, conquering territory after territory. For the first time in history, Australians realized the war might reach their own shores. And in those tense days, the Australian Army needed something that could punch above its weight, something that could stop the relentless advance of the Imperial Japanese Army, known for its fierce spirit and terrifying close-quarter tactics. The answer came not from a factory in Sydney, but from a long line of British engineering. The Ordnance QF 25-pounder was designed in the 1932nd as Britain's standard field gun and howitzer, a mix of range, speed, and flexibility that no other artillery piece could match. When the Australians adopted it, they quickly realized it wasn't just another British import. It was going to become their backbone. By the time Australian gunners deployed it to North Africa and later to the Pacific, the 25-pounder had already built a reputation. In desert warfare, it could flatten enemy positions miles away with deadly accuracy. But it was in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, where it became something else entirely, a weapon that changed the psychology of the battlefield. The Japanese soldier was trained to fight at close-range stealth, night attacks, ambushes, and hand-to-hand combat. They believed in getting close, overwhelming the enemy before they could bring their heavy weapons to bear. But the Australians used the 25-pounder in a way the Japanese had not expected. Imagine the thick jungle canopy of Buna or Milne Bay. The air is wet and heavy, the ground slick with rain and mud. You can barely see 20 yards ahead. And somewhere in that dense, green wall, hidden by camouflage nets and branches, sits a small team of Australian artillerymen. Their gun is dug into a clearing, its barrel elevated high. A soft hiss as the fuse is adjusted. The loader wipes the sweat off his brow. A single order is shouted, "Fire!" Then it happens. A thunderclap, a streak of orange light, and seconds later, deep in the jungle ahead, an explosion rolls through the trees like a physical force. The ground trembles, branches snap, shrapnel slices through bamboo and palm. The Japanese patrol that was creeping forward, silent, invisible, is torn apart before they even realize they've been spotted. That was the psychological power of the 25-pounder. It wasn't just killing, it was domination through sound and shock. The gun's unique design made it terrifyingly effective in the close terrain of the Pacific. Its shells, each weighing around 25 pounds, hence the name, could be fused for airburst, detonating above the ground to rain down a storm of deadly fragments. Against jungle fighters hiding in trees, bunkers, or ravines, there was no escape. But it wasn't only the blast that broke the Japanese spirit. It was the relentless rhythm. The Australians had mastered what soldiers called creeping fire. They'd lay down a rolling wall of explosions that moved forward in perfect time with advancing infantry. It was like a living monster roaring, marching, devouring everything in its path. The Japanese began calling it the thunder that never misses. Some survivors of the New Guinea campaign recalled that hearing the 25-pounder was more terrifying than facing tanks or aircraft. Tanks could be avoided, bombers could fly away, but the artillery, it felt personal, and that's where the hatred began. Captured Japanese diaries told grim stories, men writing of sleepless nights under bombardment, of comrades torn apart by invisible shells, of the hopelessness of charging positions that were already zeroed in by Australian gunners. In their eyes, the 25-pounder wasn't just a gun. It was an insult, a reminder that the bush soldiers of Australia, once mocked as inexperienced colonials, could now wield modern warfare better than anyone. Even the Japanese officers, who prided themselves on discipline, could not ignore the effect. Units that had once fought to the last man were seen breaking under artillery barrages, abandoning positions, or refusing to move forward. The weapon's reputation spread far and wide. Rumors circulated that Australian gunners could hear enemy whispers through the trees, that somehow they always knew where to aim. The truth was less mystical, but equally devastating. The Australians had perfected forward observation, using spotters and radios to coordinate fire with stunning accuracy. By late 1943, the sound of the 25-pounder became a warning, a death sentence for anyone caught in its reach. But the Japanese hatred of the gun ran deeper than fear. It was cultural. To them, the 25-pounder represented something dishonorable, the destruction of the warrior's code. Japanese soldiers were trained to meet the enemy face to face, blade to bayonet, proving their courage through direct battle. Artillery stripped that away. It killed from afar, without emotion, without honor. To be blown apart by an unseen gun was not just death, it was humiliation. And that humiliation burned in their memories long after the fighting ended. In war, fear is one thing, but when fear turns into hatred, it reveals something far darker about what a weapon truly means. The QF 25-pounder was not a machine of beauty. It was squat, heavy, and ugly. But to the Australians, it was a friend that saved lives. To the Japanese, it was a ghost that haunted every jungle they entered. The hatred for that gun was born from a truth no one wanted to admit, that courage alone could not stand against precision, discipline, and firepower. As the Pacific War dragged on, the 25-pounder would earn a place in military history. But for the men who faced it, especially in those forgotten battles across the islands, it was more than a weapon. It was the sound of defeat itself. And in the next part, we'll uncover how the PARD, Australians used that sound as a psychological weapon. The stories of battles where the 25-pounder turned the tide, and the dark secrets that made Japanese soldiers loathe it more than any other gun in the Pacific. The jungle of New Guinea is a place that tests men in every conceivable way. The air is thick with humidity, the mud clings to boots and uniforms, and every step can conceal a hidden enemy. It's a world of silence and shadows until the first 25-pounder round screams through the canopy. The Australians learned to use the jungle itself as a weapon. They positioned their guns in concealed clearings, often dug into natural depressions or behind ridges. Observers, hidden in trees or camouflaged huts, would watch Japanese patrols inching through the undergrowth, marking each movement, each pause. Then, with a signal transmitted over crackling radios, the guns would fire. And when they did, it wasn't just a shell that fell, it was a message that the Australians were always watching, always ready, always precise. In battles like Bougainville, Milne Bay, and later Bougainville, the QF 25-pounder became more than artillery. It became an extension of Australian will. Soldiers recall that the sound of its firing, that deep, rolling boom, was almost hypnotic. It struck fear before destruction even occurred. Men cowered, hearts pounding, sweat running, waiting for that inevitable whistle and explosion that would rip through the jungle like a knife through cloth. The Japanese, who had once moved swiftly and silently, were forced to adapt. But adaptation came at a price. Their tactics, honed in China and across the Pacific, relied on surprise and aggression. The 25-pounder eliminated both. Units that had survived air attacks and small arms fire were now being shredded by an unseen hand. Artillery made no distinction between officers and soldiers, between the brave and the reckless. Some historians argue that no other weapon had such a profound psychological effect on Japanese troops in the Pacific. The gun didn't just kill, it disrupted, it destroyed confidence. In diaries recovered after the war, Japanese soldiers wrote of long nights spent crouched in mud, praying that the Australians would miscalculate. They described the sound of the shells as a living creature, creeping closer and closer, whispering death in the darkness. The Australians, on the other hand, treated the 25-pounder almost like a character in their own story. They nicknamed it affectionately, maintained it obsessively, and took pride in its precision. To them, it was dependable, loyal, and brutally honest. The contrast between this intimacy and the Japanese terror could not have been more stark. What made the 25-pounder truly feared, however, was its flexibility. Unlike larger artillery pieces that required long setup and heavy transport, the 25-pounder could be quickly moved and deployed, even through treacherous jungle terrain. Crews used sledges, ropes, and sheer manpower to haul it across rivers, swamps, and steep hills. This mobility allowed Australian commanders to lay down unpredictable fire patterns, catching Japanese units off guard and making escape nearly impossible. In some battles, the Australians even employed counter-battery fire, targeting Japanese artillery positions with uncanny accuracy. The Japanese could fire at Australian lines, thinking themselves safe under the cover of trees or ridges, only to find their guns destroyed before they could strike again. This constant threat eroded morale in ways that small arms fire never could. Stories from survivors illustrate how the gun became an almost supernatural presence in the minds of Japanese soldiers. In one account from Bougainville, a Japanese patrol described moving silently at night, only for an artillery round to fall mere yards away, precise, deliberate, and unrelenting. They wrote that the Australians knew where we were before we did. This wasn't magic. It was observation, experience, and the deadly coordination of a well-trained artillery unit. But to soldiers in fear, it felt like fate itself was turned against them. Beyond its battlefield efficiency, the 25-pounder also exacted a psychological toll through its sheer destructiveness. Each 25-pound shell created a small crater, threw debris and shrapnel in every direction, and could obliterate jungle fortifications that the Japanese had spent days constructing. Bunkers, trenches, and hidden gun pits became death traps, and every explosion was a reminder that nowhere was safe. The Australians even experimented with indirect fire, shooting over ridges or around bends in the terrain, striking enemy positions they couldn't see directly. The Japanese soldiers, trained to rely on stealth and visual contact, found this terrifying. No longer could they trust what they saw or what they heard. The unseen threat of a 25-pounder round above them became a shadow that haunted every decision. Interestingly, some accounts suggest that the psychological effect of the gun lasted longer than its physical impact. In later campaigns, Japanese units, even before entering an area, feared the gun's presence so intensely that they would delay attacks or retreat prematurely. It had become a force multiplier, achieving victories without direct engagement. The gun's reputation spread beyond individual battles. Officers whispered about the Australian Devil gun in mess halls, training camps, and correspondence. The legend of the 25-pounder grew because of one undeniable truth. It combined the precision of modern artillery with a ruthless efficiency in terrain that seemed tailor-made for ambushes. Even when Japanese soldiers survived the explosions, the psychological scars remained. Survivors reported hearing the deep thrum of the gun in dreams, reliving moments of chaos, confusion, and fear. And as these stories were shared among units, the hatred for the gun deepened, no longer just fear, but resentment, and in some cases, a fixation on revenge that could never be satisfied. The Australians, aware of this effect, leaned into it. They coordinated fire with infantry advances, planned barrages that targeted likely enemy hiding spots, and perfected timing so that every shot reinforced their dominance. Every explosion in the jungle wasn't random. It was a statement, a demonstration of power that reinforced their control over the battlefield. Yet, despite its destructive capabilities, the 25-pounder wasn't infallible. It relied on meticulous calculation, careful positioning, and skilled crews. If misused, it could waste ammunition or even endanger friendly forces. But the Australians, through rigorous training and battlefield experience, minimized these risks, turning the gun into a weapon that was as precise as it was terrifying. By the time campaigns in New Guinea and Borneo were concluding, the QF 25-pounder had earned a permanent place in the lore of the Pacific War. It was admired by Australian soldiers for its reliability and feared by the Japanese, not only for the destruction it caused, but for the sense of helplessness it instilled. And so, the hatred of the Japanese soldiers wasn't born merely from the gun's power. It came from what it represented: the erosion of their tactical confidence, the violation of their warrior ethos, and the unrelenting dominance of an unseen foe. In the next part, we will step into the final, desperate battles where the 25-pounder became not just a tool of war, but a decisive factor in victory. We'll see first-hand accounts of Japanese units facing it, Australian crews operating under fire, and the moments where the thunder of the 25-pounder determined life or death. The climax of its story is as much about the human spirit as it is about steel and gunpowder, the ultimate testament to why the Japanese truly hated this weapon. The final chapters of the Pacific campaigns were defined not by grand fleets or massive tanks, but by the quiet, calculated thunder of the 25-pounder. In places like Bougainville, Borneo, and New Britain, the Australians faced the remnants of battle-hardened Japanese units, men who were desperate, disciplined, and dangerous. Yet even these veterans could not escape the shadow of the gun. The Australians had learned to synchronize their artillery with infantry movements, transforming the battlefield into a deadly choreography. Each 25-pounder round was a dancer in a grim ballet, timed to suppress enemy fire, protect advancing troops, and create corridors of destruction through dense jungle. The Japanese soon realized that trying to counter it head-on was futile. Any frontal assault meant certain death, while retreat offered only temporary respite, for the gun could be relocated faster than the enemy could react. One account from Bougainville tells of a Japanese battalion dug into a ridge, preparing for a counterattack. The Australians, using forward observers perched in the trees, calculated range and trajectory with almost surgical precision. As the first rounds tore through the jungle, the Japanese troops barely had time to react. Trees were splintered, foxholes collapsed, and men were thrown into the mud by the sheer force of the explosions. By the time the battalion regrouped, morale had crumbled. They had not just been defeated, they had been humiliated. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Survivors recalled the terror of being hunted by an unseen enemy, their positions destroyed by invisible fire, and the constant, rhythmic thunder that signaled no respite. Japanese officers noted that fear spread faster than bullets. Units abandoned strategic positions, patrols retreated, and coordination broke down entirely. The 25-pounder was not only a weapon of destruction, but a master of chaos. But there were moments where the gun truly proved its legendary status. During the advance on Cape Gloucester, Australian gunners faced entrenched Japanese positions that had repelled infantry assaults for weeks. Traditional artillery had failed. Airstrikes had been inconclusive. Then came the 25-pounders, dug in on ridges, firing indirect barrages into the enemy's network of bunkers and tunnels. The jungle shook with each detonation. Explosions were so close that soldiers reported the ground trembling beneath their feet. After hours of relentless fire, the positions that had seemed impregnable were reduced to rubble, allowing Australian infantry to advance with minimal casualties. In one haunting account, a Japanese officer wrote about hearing the rolling thunder of the 25-pounders from a nearby ridge, knowing that every step forward, every attempt at movement, would be met with destruction. He described the sound as a living demon, patient, calculating, and inexorable. That image captured exactly why Japanese soldiers hated the gun so deeply. It was more than metal and fire. It had become an almost supernatural presence, controlling the battlefield and dictating the fate of men. The Australians themselves felt the weight of responsibility. Operating the 25-pounder required nerves of steel, precision, and coordination. Each round had to be calculated, every shot deliberate. A misfire could endanger comrades. Yet crews often worked tirelessly through the sweltering heat, rain, and mud, moving the guns through impossible terrain and firing under enemy fire. Their determination transformed the gun from a piece of equipment into an instrument of fate. As the war drew to a close, the stories of the QF 25-pounder's dominance circulated far and wide. Australian soldiers recounted it in letters and memoirs, describing how it had saved lives, turned the tide of battles, and instilled fear into an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable. Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, carried memories of the gun like a scar, vivid, painful, and unforgotten. Even decades later, veterans from both sides spoke of it with awe and dread. For Australians, it was a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and survival. For the Japanese, it represented an instrument of inescapable punishment, a reminder that courage alone could not withstand precision and power. The hatred had been earned through repeated exposure to its lethal efficiency, its psychological grip, and its unyielding presence on the battlefield. The story of the QF 25-pounder is, in many ways, a story about the nature of warfare itself. It reveals how a single weapon, when wielded by disciplined and courageous soldiers, can alter the course of battles and even shape the psychology of an entire army. It shows that war is not only fought with bullets and bombs, but also with fear, anticipation, and the invisible threads that tie men to life or death. By the end of the Pacific War, the 25-pounder had achieved something extraordinary. It had earned the respect of those who used it, the fear of those who faced it, and a permanent place in military history. It was not flashy. It did not have the glamour of tanks or the drama of aircraft dogfights. But in the dense, suffocating jungles of the Pacific, it became a legend, feared, hated, and revered in equal measure. And so, the dark reason Japanese soldiers hated the QF 25-pounder was not simply because of the metal and explosives. It was because it stripped them of control, shattered their confidence, and reduced even the most disciplined warriors to a state of helpless terror. It represented a truth that many could not face, that in war, preparation, precision, and relentless force could triumph over bravery and honor. The gun's roar echoed long after the last battles were fought. For Australians, it became a symbol of survival, a friend that never failed. For the Japanese, it became a phantom of memory, a reminder of fear, loss, and the merciless power of modern warfare. In the end, the QF 25-pounder's legacy is more than historical. It is a testament to the human capacity to innovate under pressure, to adapt and survive, and to wield tools of war with skill and courage. It is also a reminder that sometimes The most feared weapons are not the largest or most complex, but the ones that strike with deadly precision, unpredictability, and an unrelenting voice that says, "There is no escape." And in the dense jungles, the forgotten ridges, and the memory of men who fought and fell, the thunder of the 25-pounder will forever be remembered, a dark, haunting echo of a war where courage met an unstoppable force, and fear learned a name.